literary quote, "These are the times that try men's souls." But there have been trying times before. There will be again. But our Congress continues to be urged to do things that sound like a great solution, sound like a good, compassionate thing to do. But when you get to the bottom of them, sometimes they're the most uncompassionate things we could do. For example, reports of sexual abuse victims who are female being deeply troubled. There are FBI statistics that indicate that perhaps 18, maybe 20% of women in America have been sexually assaulted. Other types of crimes on females raise the percentage even higher. And there's statistics that indicate transgender may be 0.3%. Who knows what the right numbers are, but I think we should be far more compassionate with female sexual abuse victims that comprise such a large number in weighing whether you want to have men come walking in on women in restrooms, dressing rooms. Also, the talk has been this year that we are going to have sentencing reform because it's the compassionate thing to do. We're told that there are massive, massive numbers of people who have been incarcerated in federal prison for simple possession cases. And that you know, we've moved on, we've evolved in this country. And having been a judge of a felony court, I can't say I did the right thing on sentencing in every case, but I can say I struggled. I got all the information that was available. I considered it before we ever undertook the sentencing hearing. I considered everything submitted at the sentencing hearing and wrestled and tried to get to a just and appropriate sentence. Judges do that all over the country. Some think they're being compassionate and quickly release criminals, not being quite as dedicated to reviewing backgrounds and the indications of repeat offense but so they release people too quickly, sentence them too lightly, and they go back and commit other offenses. We know from the recidivism rate that's going to happen, but you try your best as a judge to do the right thing. And then the thought of someone in Washington that never, ever reviewed all of the facts of the case, never heard all of the evidence that you or the jury heard in assessing sentence, who have just got some big picture that they think they may be able to apply and generalize sufficiently. The thought that they would come in and say, we're going to have this blanket set aside, a reduction in the sentence that was achieved through a very deliberative process is repugnant. There are also a lot of fallacies, a lot of fiction that's been thrown out regarding sentences. So vast many that have been sentenced to and sitting in federal prison for just having a little bit of marijuana. You know, we got to let those go. Well, anybody that is prosecuted knows, whether you prosecute it as a state prosecutor or a federal prosecutor, federal prosecutors have traditionally not been interested in small possession cases. They're not interested. I mean, they weren't in East Texas. And when I was in court, I've been a prosecutor and a judge. The state prosecutors in East Texas and the federal prosecutors actually work very well together. Every now and then, there might be a rare case where the state prosecutors would realize that there was a very heinous offense that was committed, but the federal court may have a higher range of punishment, and because this person is such a threat to society, might ask the federal prosecutors to take a look to see if this is something you would be interested in pursuing. More often than not, it was not, but most of those cases are handled in state court. I don't have any doubt that we should be reviewing drug offenses when it comes to the new opium-related cases. There's been so many developments, and we've got development of synthetics now that were not known, so they're not listed as items that would generate a prison sentence, that do enough damage to individuals that they should be considered to be listed and a crime to possess. So those are things we need to be constantly looking at. But there's an article from Adam Credo, the Free Beacon, from yesterday. Headline, Obama administration freed 19,723 criminal illegal immigrants in 2015. It says the Obama administration released nearly 20,000 illegal immigrants convicted of crimes from custody in 2015. According to new figures published by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Bureau, the 19,723 illegal immigrants freed from custody during the last year had a total of 64,197 convictions between them, according to the data. This included 8,324 violent convictions and 208 homicide convictions. Those are people who came into the country illegally, not only broke our immigration laws to come into the country, some of them coming in more than once illegally, some after they've been deported and come back in to commit more crimes, but nearly 20,000 released in 2015, according to Immigration Customs Enforcement, according to ICE. And it doesn't appear that they're being all deported. And certainly, if they were, there's no bar to them turning right around and coming back, as the one man who had, I think it was 9 DWI cases that came before me in a felony court, and the federal authorities had never been interested in deporting him until he had a violent accident. And he came before me, and I sent him appropriately to prison. And within 6 months, he's back in my court. So I had to ask through the interpreter that since I sent him to prison, how is he back in my court for a new crime of violence on other people? And it turned out that very shortly after I sent him to prison. Finally, the federal authorities acted, just much too late for victims that were involved, and they deported him, and according to what he said through his interpreter, they took him down to the border and watched him go across the border, and then as soon as the people that deported him left, that same day, that same hour, he came right back across the border. What about all the victims? We want to talk about compassion. What about all the victims of the people who have been harmed, hurt, obviously cases of people being killed because we don't secure our border? And instead of letting people serve out the sentences that a court very deliberately sentenced, they let them go like we're some ubiquitous group here in Washington. Somehow once you come into the District of Columbia, we're so much wiser than any judge sitting on any court anywhere in the federal system that we know better than they did. And I can tell you, I've heard from judges around the country that if I had known that some jerk in Washington was going to come around and reduce my sentence that I agonized to arrive at, I would have sentenced much more harshly so that the appropriate sentence would have been what was arrived at by the brilliant, wise, ubiquitous jerk in Washington that set it aside too early. This article from April 12th, sentencing reform legislation would disproportionately favor non-citizens, says U.S. prisoner data clearly shows two things. One, the majority of low-level drug offenders are serving their sentences in state, not federal prisons. Two, most of those incarcerated in federal prison for drug charges are non-citizens. While it may be worthwhile to pursue reform at the federal level, it will do very little to address the problems identified by proponents of sentencing reform, and it would do almost nothing to reduce sentences for U.S. citizen drug offenders. In fact, on further down, it says as of April 7th, 2016, there were 196,285 prisoners in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, with 46.5% of these prisoners, or 91,270, sentenced for drug offenses. The percentage of prisoners incarcerated for drugs over 2.5 times greater than the state prison population. However, overall, there are fewer prisoners serving time in federal prison for drug charges than in state prisons, which have 212,000. Federal government collects data differently for state and federal prisoners. In order to get the breakdown of offenses for federal drug prisoners, data from the U.S. Sentencing Commission is available. Looking at the sentencing statistics from fiscal year 2007 to fiscal year 2015, a clear distinction between federal and state prison populations is that the proportion of federal prisoners serving time for drug possession is much higher than that for state prisoners, and Hispanics are disproportionately represented among federal drug inmates. There is a higher ratio of Hispanics serving drug sentences for both trafficking and possession convictions in federal prison. As Daniel Horowitz points out, this is because many of the drug offenders in federal prison are serving sentences for drug convictions related to the illicit drug trade on the U.S.-Mexico border. In response to a congressional request regarding sentencing data for drug offenses, the U.S. Sentencing Commission sent data showing that 95% of the 305 individuals serving time in federal prison are non-citizens. Only 13 simple possession cases were tried in non-border districts in 2014. In a letter sent to Senator Jeff Sessions last fall, the Federal Bureau of Prisons reported that 77% of individuals convicted of federal drug possession charges and more than 25% of the individuals convicted of federal drug trafficking charges in 2015 were non-citizens. So I think sometimes graphs give us a good look, give us a better picture of what we're talking about than a word picture does. So here's what the FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Prisons, reported last fall, that of all the people in prison, in federal prison, U.S. federal prison for drug possession charges and convictions, 77% are non-citizens of the United States. That's right. We're using our United States prisons when it comes to federal possession of drugs. 77% of them housed are non-citizens. 23% of those in federal prison for drug possession charges, convictions, are citizens of the United States. The profile for federal drug prisoners is different than that at the state level, and this is why Congress needs to recognize and address these differences when crafting legislation that will affect this population. Federal drug and immigration enforcement are now inextricably tied together, and Mexican drug cartels are a serious threat to public safety. A serious debate over how to best address the war on drugs and its effects on American communities cannot ignore the immigration component. Sentencing reform bills reducing penalties for some federal prisoners are being portrayed by their supporters as long overdue corrective to harsh sentencing laws for individuals who violate federal drug laws, which they argue create racial disparities in the nation's prison population. Reforming drug sentencing laws is one thing. Releasing criminal aliens back into the United States interior is quite another. The Obama administration has already shown its willingness to do the latter, including those who were deemed to be criminal threats to the public. Without a bill with strong, clear language, and most importantly, a Congress willing to extend oversight over the executive branch, it's plain that the sentencing reform legislation likely to soon come before Congress will accomplish little more than to provide early release for dangerous criminal aliens while still failing to hold President Obama to account for his failure to enforce U.S. immigration law. This article from Daniel Horowitz from this month, Conservative Review, said, yes, it was all an April Fool's joke. The entire rationale and premise on which the top legislative priority of the D.C. people was built is an illusion. On a federal level, there is no widespread epidemic of people being locked up for nonviolent drug offenses. The entire debate over the prison population on federal level is absurd. Proponents of jailbreak legislation speak about the issue in the abstract and concoct all sorts of myths as to who is sentenced for crimes. This is, in fact, a finite and verifiable population. Why don't we stop talking past each other and actually take a look at what is the 800-pound gorilla behind the federal criminal justice system? And from there, he goes on to talk about illegal immigration and the effect on our prisons. He says, what is clear when you juxtapose the total convictions to the large number of immigration-related sentences and the drug trafficking convictions, the 800-pound gorilla in the room when dealing with federal crimes is illegal immigration, both directly by clogging up the system with immigration cases and indirectly through the open border and drug cartels and proliferation of drugs. More than half of all federal sentences are a byproduct of immigration and the drugs that are brought in as a result of the porous border. Hence, the entire premise of federal jailbreak legislation, that there are infinite numbers of individuals serving time in federal prison for nonviolent drug offenses, is complete bunk. If we would deal with the immigration problem and keep out much of the drug infestation by building the fence, doesn't have to be a wall, and implementing visa tracking, both the direct effects of immigration and the drug problem, which is a byproduct of immigration, it would reach a manageable level. We would save a lot of money on incarceration costs and dramatically reduce the prison population, all without risking the safety and security of Americans by indiscriminately and retroactively releasing violent criminals into our communities. And people should understand what most prosecutors will tell you is, especially in the federal system, they don't have plea agreements like normally you find in most states. They agree on what charges they will allow a defendant to plead to and which ones they'll drop. So if there is violence in an offense, if there's a gun used in a drug offense or violence in a drug offense, and a federal prosecutor is trying to get someone involved or carrying out that violent drug offense, but they know they want to get the guy that's over this one. They want to get the bigger fish and the even bigger fish. They're going to have some kind of negotiation at that level, and what they negotiate is, all right, we'll leave off the violent part of this offense and let you plead to that. Or we'll leave out the burglary, or we'll leave out this other. We'll leave out something else, and we'll let you plead to this, and the state has agreed they won't pursue that burglary, and they work out an agreement so that part of the offense that would have gotten them a much more severe sentence is left out in return for their cooperation to go after the bigger fish. So when somebody in Washington that has not analyzed the facts of each case and the reason for the recommended charge to be accepted by the court, and they go about and just release somebody, they're normally going to do an injustice to the victim. Some say drugs are a victimless crime, and some are tempted to think that until they look at the involvement of drugs in violent crime, in burglaries. It's phenomenal. And with a porous border the way we have, we see the drugs pouring in, and I literally say we see. We had a hearing yesterday with a lady who lived down near the border. Actually, she pointed out that our federal law enforcement, immigration officials, are about 25 miles north of the border before they do enforcement. We're not enforcing the border there in Arizona, at where she was pointing out. And she and her husband put up video cameras and was displaying in the hearing. Clearly, these were guys carrying big amounts of something, apparently drugs, passing by, back and forth, just bringing drugs into America because we were not enforcing and securing our border and our country. So if we want to have true sentencing reform, it should not be undertaken until the border is secure, so that we know we're not releasing more criminals to the interior of the United States to commit more crimes and to be back involved in the drug trade. I know some years back, after I got here, Congress decided to make it more difficult for people to get Sudafed because it's used in the process of producing methamphetamine. And in East Texas, cooking methamphetamine was a problem. But most of the cooks stunk. And so when people would smell something vile and they called in, immediately law enforcement would think, oh, maybe some meth being cooked. They would go, and often that was the case. So we made it hard for law-abiding people to get Sudafed that works a whole lot better than Sudafed with any initials after it that's not true Sudafed. And some of the DEA and law enforcement back in Texas tell me, well, what's happened? Yeah, we were able to shut down a lot of methamphetamine cooking in Texas, but since our border is so porous, the drug cartels in Mexico right across our border are pouring through synthetics and far more potent drugs. They're hooking our young people, our Americans, on drugs that are harder to get off of and induce more unpleasantness and crime. So we really didn't solve anything because we didn't deal with what was called the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's illegal immigration. It's an unsecure border. And, of course, some can't help but raise questions about political motivation, because when you're trying desperately to win, say, a presidential election or local election, say in Virginia, and you know from surveys that have been done, can restore the voting rights to people that have been in prison, a big majority of those will vote Democrat. And then when you think about the potential, wow, so if we just cut loose a massive number of illegal immigrants that are in prison, and then you have a governor like you have in Virginia, then says, hey, we're going to let felons have voting rights. Never mind, you're not supposed to vote unless you're a U.S. citizen. We're finding that there is fraud in elections, despite what some say. My friend John Fund had a good book on the fraud involved in the elections and the voting process around the country. Look, if we're going to stop from disenfranchising real voters and real American citizens, then we got to make sure that we have legitimate voters. That means a voter ID. Why not? I mean, you got to have an ID to do much of anything in this country. Why not have one and make sure that the disenfranchising process is not happening, because we make sure that every voter is a legitimate voter? Those who are worried about it preventing minorities from voting could look at places like Georgia. It's been established that when photo ID requirements were added, there were actually more minorities that voted after that. It didn't disenfranchise minority. What it disenfranchised were people that wanted to vote as aliens or illegally. But parenthetically, Mr. Speaker, I can't help but wonder, if you were the head of a political party, hypothetically, if you're the head of a political party, and your party believes their hope for winning the next election was to get people who were felons to vote, whether they'd reformed or not. Maybe it's time to take a look at what your party stands for. My time up? Then I'll